Good evening, brothers and sisters. It is your belated pastor getting a little bit of a late start tonight. It's good to be with you. Welcome. It has been a great week, and I hope that it has been you have been blessed as well. As it's been a lot going on, and I know it's been trying for many people. Even as we start thinking about going forward as a congregation, as a community, as a state, and as a nation, we keep being reminded of the presence of this virus. I mean, we're still really in a time of international crisis in many ways, and but I'm reminded that this is not the first time the church has faced a major disruption, and just as history has judged them in retrospect, how we respond at this present time will be not only a witness for our faith, but will also be reported and evaluated by future generations. They're going to look back on us and see how we handled ourselves in the midst of a difficult time. So how do we want our response to be remembered? So in our psalm for tonight, we're going to look at how David responded to a crisis in his life, and perhaps see a little bit of a plan for ourselves going forward. It's from Psalm 16. Psalm 16, we believe, was written by David. His name is in the title, and very early on, and that's a good indication that he was the author of this particular psalm. And so we believe that it's David's petition to God for his preservation. And we don't know the specific occasion for David writing this, but there are certainly times in his life we can point to and say that been at this point, when Saul was pursuing him, is probably the most likely for this particular psalm. He mentions death or Sheol, the grave, down in verse 10. So whatever the occasion is, David feels like he's being confronted by death, by his own mortality. He faces this major crisis in his life, and he wrote this psalm in response to that crisis. So if you have your Bibles, you want to read along, it's going to be Psalm 16. It's just 11 verses long, really short. We're going to read that together, and then we're going to talk about that briefly. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints of the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names on my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. Therefore, my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You have known to me, you make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Beautiful, beautiful psalm. I hope that you'll be able to go back and read that and then spend a little bit of time in contemplation, because it really is one of the psalms that I go to for comfort and for strength. And it has certainly been a source of strength in my life. When a preacher preaches, when I preach, usually I'll try to address an issue that members of the congregation are facing. Sometimes I'm the member I'm thinking about. I think, oh boy, I'm really struggling with this. I wonder if anybody else is. So sometimes a sermon or a lesson is applicable to everyone, but a lot of times, in fact, most of the time, it's only applicable to certain individuals in the congregation. Sometimes I'll preach a sermon out and I'll get done with it and I'll think, boy, that couldn't have helped anybody. And sure enough, one or two people will come up and say how much that particular lesson meant to me, that it really, how it meant what it meant to them, that it really spoke to a present need in their life. And there are other times that I will preach a sermon and I'll think, boy, I needed to hear that. That was really a good one. And everybody's like, yeah, that was okay. But for me, that was a need I was really trying to address, I guess, in my own life. Right now, all of us are faced with a similar issue, right? This international pandemic of the coronavirus. So how will we respond to this crisis, or really any crisis? How will we respond? And Psalm 16 gives us a sort of a 3-step plan of action that is really easy to remember. Now, I'm just going to give it to you up front. So if you get cut off, you'll already have the plan. Step 1 is to pray. Step 2 is to give thanks. And step 3 is to rejoice. Pray, give thanks, rejoice. That's it. It starts with prayer. David's prayer to God in this psalm begins right off the bat. Preserve me, O God. That's David's petition to the Lord. Preserve me, O God. Now, the Hebrew word for preserve means to hedge about. Like imagine you're camping in the wilderness and you're worried about being attacked by wild animals. You would build a hedge and you would take these thorny bushes and chop them down and build those around you. I had a friend of mine whose wife spent some time in Africa, and she was out in just the bush and was in a village that had this enormous 10-foot tall wall of thorny hedges built all the way around it to keep out lions. And so preserve means to hedge about, like with thorns, to guard and to protect, right? And David wanted God to protect him from this crisis. In the midst of this crisis he was facing. So again, most likely it was Saul at this point that wanted to kill David, but there were certainly other people in David's life at different points that were pursuing him. Right now, we all want God to sort of preserve us in times of crisis, to put this hedge, this wall of protection about us. Currently, the crisis that we're most keenly aware of is the coronavirus, and so our petition to God is fairly similar as to David's. Preserve us, O God. And David says for God to preserve him, he says, for in you I take refuge. Now, another interesting Hebrew word is the word for refuge. It means like a shelter. Again, imagine that you're living in a much more primitive lifestyle and you've got a storm that comes up, or perhaps it's the heat of the day and you're like, I'm going to pass out here. It's so heat. I'm so strong. I need shelter from the sun or shelter from the storm. When the Lord brought his people up out of Egypt into the promised land, one of the first things he had them do was to establish cities of refuge, to which people who were accused of unintentional manslaughter could flee and find safety. Imagine that you're out working in a field and you're working with someone and they fall off a cliff and they die. Well, now there's no one to testify that it was an accident. What if this other person's family says that you pushed him, right? What if they say you hit him with a rock and knocked him over the cliff and killed him? So God had the people establish these cities of refuge, places you could go where you would be safe from these accusations. David says that his refuge was not in a city. His refuge was in the Lord himself. In other words, David was grounding his preservation in the person of the Lord. He belonged in the Lord. And that was the basis for his petition. The same way, you belong in your house. You can walk into your house and take shelter anytime because that's where you belong. David is likening God to his refuge, right? This is where I can go for safety and peace from the storms that rage outside. And you can really read David's certainty in this refuge, certainty in this security. He's so certain that even though he's still in the midst of this crisis, he says he can actually take delight in the Lord. Now, here's David's life. And David's life is filled with crisis after crisis. When you read his story, right? He escaped. There were some 16 attempts on his life by Saul that we know of, recorded in Scripture. He faced, a crisis early in his public life when he was threatened by Goliath, right? David was engaged in numerous bloody battles when he led the people of God into battle, and he encountered betrayal by his own family and by his best friend, and so on and so on and so on. And yet, through it all, David says to God, I have no good apart from you. Now, that's how the Message paraphrases this particular saying, that apart from God, I have no good. Without you, nothing makes sense. And so David delights in the Lord. And this delight is so complete. Like he's so overwhelmed with delight in the Lord that he looks out and he sees God's people and he takes delight in them because they belong in the Lord too. David says in verse 3, as for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones in whom is all my delight. The saints in the Lord are those faithful followers of God, which would, in David's case, make them his brothers and sisters in the Lord, right? They are like him, taking refuge in the Lord. They, like him, look to God for their security, and that's what built their kinship, right? Just like you and I have this kinship in God through Jesus Christ, and we can take a similar stance in that, because we're both in the Lord, that makes us brothers and sisters. We can delight in one another. Now, so there's the beginning with this prayer, right? It starts with prayer, but David's certainty in the security of God, because he was so certain in the security he had in God, David goes on beyond his petition to actually give thanks for his present blessings. He prays for help, and then he gives thanks for his present blessings. David says down in verse 5, the Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot, right? When the people of God entered the promised land, every tribe except for the tribe of Levi was assigned a portion of land in which to live. And because of their service to the Lord in the sanctuary, the Levites were given the Lord as their special portion. They didn't have a land. And David sort of sees himself in a very similar way. He enjoys this beautiful personal relationship with God, that God is his portion. And in verse 6, he says, the lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. Now, and when each of these tribes inherited a portion of land, they found in each portion that there were these pleasant places everywhere. In the promised land, there were these pleasant places, and David found delight in what God had called him to do. I have this pleasant place in the Lord. I am content in who I am and what I am called to do. And then down in verse 8, he says, I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. David has this very clear sense that the Lord was with him. So he was not shaken when he faced a crisis because his sovereign companion was with him. So he was able to give thanks. Even in the midst of crisis, David was able to give this thanks. And finally, last step, third step, is to rejoice in a future hope. Now, the Old Testament Hebrew is really curious in the way it uses, like we have verb tenses, present tense, I am doing, past tense, I did, or future tense, I will do. But the Hebrew has this perfect sense, perfect future sense. In other words, it's looking to the future, and it's so certain that it's like it's already done. It's just, if you can just count on, I am so certain that it's like it's already in the past tense, like it's already been completed. So in verses 9 through 10, David says, therefore my heart is glad and my soul, my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. Now, the crisis is not over. David is still being pursued for his life. And yet he's like, I'm already rejoicing because I just know it's already done. My flesh dwells secure. I'm already secure in the midst of this crisis. Because he says, for you will not, and this is really curious. David says, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. Now, Sheol was just the place of the dead, the grave. The Hebrew word Sheol means, grave, or sometimes it's translated hell. That's not a great translation because it's just the place of the dead. It wasn't a place of punishment. I mean, you died, that was the punishment, but not hell in the way that we would understand it later in the New Testament. But David's statement is remarkable because here he's living hundreds of years before God's promise to deliver his people through everlasting life, through Jesus. David's living long before that. And yet he already has this firm belief that God is not going to abandon him, that he's going to preserve him. And that's, it could be a pointing forward towards a resurrection hope or some sort of life after death. But David is certain in this, in the way he says that. David says down in verse 11b, in your presence there is fullness of joy. For David, the fullness of joy was found in this presence of God. We look forward as Christians, we have a future hope. But the focal point of this future hope is not pearly gates or the streets of gold or the crystal sea or the angels or even the magnificence of heaven itself. Not even with the saints who will be gathered around us, right? No, the focal point of our future glory is the fullness of joy that will be found in the presence of God. Everything lacking in us will be made full and whole and complete. We're going to see God and be immeasurably filled, overflowing with joy. We're going to be overcome with the presence of our glorified Savior. Everything about us will be made right. And oftentimes we think about like the physical ailments, especially as we age. I have somehow contracted golfer's elbow. And so every day my elbow hurts just a little bit. And I know it's a temporary thing and it's not a big deal. And there's a lot of people, and maybe even some of you, who are going through a lot worse on a daily basis. But just that daily reminder of pain, of just something's not going to be right today, that's going to be gone forever. Like I'm always going to be in perfect shape. not physically. We're not talking about the physical body, but just like there'll be no more pain, there'll be no more suffering, there'll be no more sorrow because we are in the presence of the Lord, and that joy that we take from him, it just overflows. We'll be complete and whole and full. We're going to rejoice in this fullness of joy. Well, I hope that this psalm and study has been a blessing to you. I know it has been to me. Again, I want to encourage you to go back and reread Psalm 16 on your own. I think that you will find another measure of comfort in it when you take it now back on your own. So may God bless you and the study of his word this evening.